Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that there's a bunch of different devices out there that allow you to play your old favorite classics on newer hardware. And I love this idea. In fact, this is the reason why I started a channel here in the first place. However, there's a flip side to all of this, and that is that it's a very popular space right now, and so because of that, the market is just getting flooded with all these various ways that you can play your favorite retro games. And honestly, when I first started this channel, I didn't think I would ever be in the position I'm in now, which is that I have so many different ways of playing these classic games that honestly I never really get to them. Part of that is the fact that I always have a new review and new device to work on, but then also because I have so many different choices, I just don't know where to start. And so I decided over this past weekend to really unplug from that experience and to take an entire day off and only play one system and the games that are available on that one system. And as you probably figured out because you clicked on this thumbnail, is the fact that I picked up a Game Boy DMG recently. And so this is what I decided to use for an entire day. And I know what you're probably thinking, okay, big deal. Yeah, he finally played a Game Boy. But you also have to remember the context. For example, for me personally, I had not played an original Game Boy since back in the early 90s. Like I hadn't even touched one until recently. And so that's what I want to focus on here in this video. It had been so long since I touched a Game Boy that it was a brand new experience to me. In addition, I had all the hindsight of all those other devices that I had tested before and my expectations of what a Game Boy should be like. And it turns out that what I thought in my head of what a Game Boy should be as far as when you're playing it is totally different when you actually have it here in 2023. And so I'm hoping this will be a pretty laid back video where I just talk about my experience 30 years later when I'm finally playing the original Game Boy. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, let's start by talking about the Game Boy that I bought, because I did make some deliberate decisions when making that purchase. Number one, I didn't want any sort of real life upgrade. So for example, I kept the original screen, I didn't want like an OCA laminated or IPS panel. And then additionally, I tried to get as close to original case as I could. Now there are those that you can buy that are just like super beat up and are definitely from 1989, but this one was a little bit different. It comes with a refreshed case. So this is probably a third-party case made somewhere in China and then shipped out, and then they put it back together with the original internals and the original screen. So yes, it does have new glass, at least here on the front, and the case itself has been upgraded, but other than that, it is supposed to be the original experience in terms of buttons and everything else. Now, when it came to playing games, I did cheat a little bit. I didn't want to have that original experience of having to cart around a bunch of cartridges, and so instead I used this thing right here. This is called an Everdrive. It's called the Everdrive GB-X7. So basically, this has an SD card slot inside of it. You put all your ROMs inside of that, and then this hooks directly into the Game Boy, and then you play your games from there. Now, the menu on this is very bare bones, but there are a couple neat features. For example, there's a little button inside this cartridge itself. So what you would do is you press down on the cartridge in order to get back into the main menu. Within there, they do have save states, so you can save a state and then load it right from there. Other than that, there's really no other options. And the nice thing about this Everdrive is that it will also work on the Game Boy Color. So if you have one of those, it'll be interchangeable between those two. And you can use it on third-party products like the Analog Pocket, which is a device that can use original cartridges. The Everdrive costs about $100 right now, and I think it's totally worth it, especially if you want to be playing on original hardware. Next, I want to talk about the controls themselves. Now, the D-pad itself is a little bit mushy feeling. It does have a rubber membrane connection feel to it, and does have that kind of classic feel like you would expect from like an NES or Super Nintendo controller. But I found that it is more mushy than I was expecting. What that means is that it's a little bit harder to press down on that rubber membrane, and then additionally, it doesn't spring back as quickly as I thought it would be either. When playing a more modern retro handheld, something like an Anbernic device, they have a different feel to them. Yes, they're using a rubber membrane connection, but it's softer and more responsive. And so because of that, I actually think the more modern gamepads just feel a little bit tighter. But all the same, as soon as I got my hands on this old school D-pad, I totally felt that difference and remembered how it used to be. Now, the face buttons are very similar as well. They have a rubber membrane connection and will push down in that kind of classic retro way, but I found with my Game Boy DMG, they don't spring up as quickly as I was expecting. Again, this could be just because we're using some older rubber membranes right here, or it just may be that there are softer ones in more modern handhelds. Either way, I found it very interesting to find that pushing down on a Game Boy button is not that different than it is today. Even when you use something like a PlayStation 5 DualSense controller, it is a very similar feel. And so really, hats off to Nintendo and the other early console makers who basically perfected the feel of a rubber membrane button way back 30 plus years ago. Now, when using these start and select buttons, these have a very retro feel to them because they're made out of rubber and very, very mushy. And honestly, I don't really mind it. You don't really push on these buttons very often. And so because of that, it's kind of cool to be able to play a game and be reminded of just how old school things are when you press on the select or start button. Taking a look at the rest of the Game Boy console, we can see that we have a single mono speaker here on the bottom right, and it still sounds pretty good. In addition, we do have a headphone jack here on the bottom. Looking on the left, we have a DC power input and then a contrast wheel. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the screen. Up top, we have our power switch. One nice thing about this is that when you turn it on, it'll lock the cartridge into place. Now on the right side, we have a volume wheel as well as our Game Boy Link connector. Now in the case I'm using here, this is actually covered up and I wasn't able to figure out how to actually open it. So I think it may actually just be permanently covered with this third-party case that I'm using here. And finally, looking at the back of the Game Boy, I have that cartridge slot, which again, I'm using with the Game Boy Everdrive. And then below that, we have our battery compartment. Now, I never owned a Game Boy back in the day, but I had friends who did. And I remember that playing this device on batteries was a huge source of anxiety for everybody. Now, a lot of that had to probably do with our age back in the day. You know, I was 9 years old when the first Game Boy came out. And to be honest, back then, getting your hands on AA batteries was next to impossible. I lived in a house of 7 people, and so batteries were just gone all the time. We had those like punch cards that would allow you to go to Radio Shack and get a battery every month, but other than that, none of us really ever had batteries. However, in today's age, it's a totally different story. For example, you can just buy batteries on Amazon, get 40 of them sent to you in a couple days. And you can find rechargeable batteries for pretty cheap too. I was also surprised to find that even though I was using generic like CVS batteries here on the device, they lasted all day. In fact, when looking up battery life on the Game Boy, they can last anywhere from 8 to 40 hours on one single set. And so I did find it interesting that I had a lot of feelings about how the battery life lasted on the Game Boy, but a lot of that was hung up on my memories and not the actual reality. When it comes down to it, 8 to 40 hours of battery life with 4 batteries is really not that bad, especially considering that this came out over 30 years ago. Next, I want to talk about ergonomics. Now, I had an inkling of how this was going to feel because I have used RetroPie cases that use a similar style. But again, when picking up the Game Boy, I was surprised to find just how chunky and solid it felt overall. It definitely has a brick-like quality to it, but all the same, there's enough roundedness to the back of the device itself that it didn't really bother me at all. In fact, I found the experience to be quite comfortable with my adult-sized hands. Now, of course, this takes away from the pocketability of the device. This is a rather large handheld, not something I would want to put in my pocket. Especially in today's age where everybody's kind of gotten used to a standard cell phone size. This is going to be much thicker than that. But I was surprised that the level of comfort I got from the Game Boy is something I would classify as an all-day level of comfort. In my time of messing around with a bunch of these games and just kind of kicking back and relaxing, the ergonomics of it never became an issue to me at all. And so in the end, yes, I would classify the Game Boy as being a very comfortable handheld. It's obviously not going to be as portable or pocketable as you would like, but I was surprised to find just how nice and comfortable it was when I did have it in my hand. Next up, let's talk about the screen. Now, this is probably the biggest surprise of them all for me. Now, of course, I knew it wasn't going to be a backlit display, but I was surprised to find just how awful it was to play unless you were in a very brightly lit condition. Even here under my studio lights, I really struggled to see what was going on the screen. Now, like I mentioned, this LCD panel may be an original one, and so because of that, it may have aged over time, and so it may not be as good as it used to be back in the day. Overall, I was just really surprised at how bad the viewing experience was on the Game Boy DMG in 2023. As a kid, I remember that I didn't really have any sort of feelings about the screen. It just worked, and it was amazing that you could just play games and you weren't having to be hooked up to a TV. Now, I do remember having to find a well-lit place. In fact, we used to play this one outdoors a lot, and so maybe that's part of it there as well, but all the same, it was surprisingly bad here in today's day and age. Now, there is a contrast toggle on the left side of the device that you can kind of move back and forth to get a better sync between your lighting conditions and what you want to see, but I also found that it was very hard to find that perfect level of contrast where it wasn't too dark, wasn't too light, but still easily visible, and so I ended up fiddling around with this toggle way more than I thought I would. Now, another thing that we've all been spoiled with in the 21st century is the fact that most panels nowadays are OCA laminated. However, on the original Game Boy, there is a pretty hefty gap between that glass screen and then the LCD panel down below. And this is something that will contribute to having pretty poor viewing angles on the Game Boy DMG. And in the end, I wasn't really bothered by this because I specifically bought this to have that old school feel. And so while I don't like it when a current console will come out with a glass panel like that, I don't mind it when it's something from 1989. Another thing I noticed is that when playing in semi-dark or semi-light conditions, the viewing is going to be pretty terrible here as well. For example, if I turn off the studio lights here, but then turn on the room lights, you can see that yes, this is going to be pretty hard to play in this kind of environment. And so this is definitely not a device I would recommend playing in the evening time unless you're near a lamp or another light source. Now, of course, comparing it to a modern retro handheld like the Mio Mini Plus right here, you can see it's a night and day difference. Number one, the contrast is going to be much more pronounced, so it's easier to see the text and things like that. But then also because it has that backlit display, you can use this in many different lighting conditions. And then, of course, you can also play these devices in the dark, unlike the Game Boy. However, in the end, I found a lot of charm in these limitations with the Game Boy. Yes, in terms of like reading text, it was kind of terrible, and the ghosting on this panel is really bad as well. But honestly, that's what I paid for. That's what I was expecting to see. And when it came to playing games, I just immediately accepted all of these shortfalls on the Game Boy in 2023. After all, that's the whole point of buying this thing in the first place, was to have this kind of experience. And it was kind of hilarious to show this to my kids and be like, hey, try to play, Kirby or whatever on this. And they're all squinting and just trying to see what was going on, which is probably what I did back in the day as well, but I just don't remember it that way. When it came to the actual games, I mostly stuck to the ones I remember from my childhood. So something like Tetris and Super Mario Land, and then Metroid 2 as well. Something else I observed about this entire experience is that the LCD ghosting is much more pronounced on the original panel compared to the LCD ghosting effects that you can add to an emulator. For example, when playing Metroid 2, you can see there's quite a ghosting trail that will follow your character as you're moving along, and same thing when you're shooting bullets. Now, you can turn on LCD ghosting within an emulator, for example here with the Mio Mini Plus, but all the same, this experience is much more crisp and clear than the original one too. I also found that the various colorization options that you have within these emulators never really seem to match that original feel. Now, the one device I found that out of the box probably had the closest to Game Boy in terms of colorization was the Analog Pocket. Now, to get these colorization options, you have to use a Game Boy cartridge or the Game Boy Studio trick, which I've shown in a previous video, but basically after you do have that set up, yeah, it's pretty close. In the end, when it came to playing games, yes, I stuck to most of my classic favorites from my childhood, mostly because I was trying to get that nostalgia rush, and so something like Fall of the Foot Clan was a really easy choice for me. Now, after spending all day yesterday with the original Game Boy, today when I got into the studio, I tried out a bunch of other handhelds just to see how they would compare. To start, I tried out my Game Boy Color. Now, this one has been upgraded all sorts of ways, and so because of that, it's not a true, genuine experience, but it has the same size shell, and so the ergonomics are going to be the same. And the things that I observed about the Game Boy Color is that it is quite a bit smaller and more pocketable than the original Game Boy, and still has pretty good ergonomics thanks to that rounded bump here on the back. Now, in today's environment, the Game Boy Color right here is a joy to play. It has an IPS panel upgrade on it, but then also a rechargeable battery pack here on the back, and some new buttons as well. And so if I was to grab one just to kind of take on a trip or something else like that, this would be a lot of fun. It's not necessarily an original experience, but all the same, this is really going to be great if you want to play old school Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. And of course, the Everdrive works in this one too, and so you can access all of those games directly on one cartridge. Now, if you're looking for a much more upgraded experience, then the Analog Pocket is going to be a really great fit too. There's a couple things to mention about this one. First, it's $220 for an Analog Pocket, and that's not including the shipping, which can be upwards of $40+ depending on where you live. But the Analog Pocket is like a Game Boy fan's dream because this thing has a 10x resolution scale of the original Game Boy. On top of that, it has the original 10:9 aspect ratio of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And I've made a few videos about the Analog Pocket, but this is using FPGA, which is going to be a hardware level emulation, so it's going to be much more accurate than a software-based emulator, which are most of the other handhelds that you can find today. And chances are, if you're a fan of the Game Boy, you already know about the Analog Pocket, because this is basically the best thing you can get for playing Game Boy games outside of original hardware. Now, the Analog Pocket comes with a cartridge slot, which you can put in Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. However, there have been recent software updates which will allow you to play games off an SD card, and so honestly, I don't use the cartridge slot anymore. In fact, I recently bought a 3D printed dust cover to cover up this area here, and that's been working out really well. I'll leave a link down below if you are interested in picking one of these up. Anyway, like I mentioned, there have been advances that'll allow you to play these games off of an SD card. And thanks to help from community developers, we have a bunch of different options here. For example, we have a number of different handheld systems as well as home consoles that can now be accessed with the Analog Pocket. And there are more and more of these cores popping up all the time, and so this is just a sample of the type of systems that you can emulate here on the Analog Pocket. However, one thing to keep in mind in addition to that high cost is that there's a huge backlog of orders for the Analog Pocket. And so right now on their page, they do say they'll ship within 2023, but this company has been known to push back those deadlines many times before. Either way, if you're looking for a very authentic experience outside of modding original hardware, then the Analog Pocket is the way to go. In fact, it even has a Game Boy link cable right here, so you can still play this like you did back in the day. Now, I also wanted to compare the original Game Boy against some modern day emulators, in particular the ones that have a vertical orientation. And starting at the cheap end of the spectrum, my two favorites are going to be these right here, the Anbernic RG35XX and then the Mio Mini Plus. These ones are quite a bit smaller than the original Game Boy. In fact, they're a little bit smaller than the Game Boy Color. But one of my favorite aspects about these is that they are very simple to set up and have a very simple user interface as well. And of course, I've made multiple videos about each of these, including a comparison between these two. In terms of price, you're looking at anywhere between like $60 and $80 depending on where you buy these. And I think that's still a pretty reasonable price given the fact that these can actually emulate all the way up to PlayStation 1. And thanks to the fact that these are using emulators, you do have a lot of extra features. For example, a rewind feature, fast forward, and the ability to change out the colorization for your various Game Boy games. In addition, these have some modern comforts like a sleep function, so all you have to do is tap on the power button, it'll go to sleep, then tap it again, and it'll wake it right back up. And there are some other nice features. For example, the Mio Mini Plus is Wi-Fi enabled. It won't allow you to play Game Boy games against two different consoles, but you can use it for retro achievements, which is pretty awesome. And while the Anbernic RG35XX does not have Wi-Fi, it does have an HDMI out, so if you wanted to plug this into a TV, you can do that very easily. Now, if you're looking for a vertical handheld and you don't mind spending a little bit extra money, I actually think that the RG353V or VS models from Anbernic are a really good choice as well. These are quite a bit more powerful than the ones we were just looking at. For example, this one can play Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, Nintendo DS, and even a little bit of PSP too. So in terms of a vertically oriented handheld that can be just kind of an all-in-one emulator, I think the 353V is probably your best bet right now. And there are two different models of this one. There's the V and the VS. Now the V is a little bit more expensive because it can dual boot into Android. It also comes with a touchscreen, which means it's going to be great for playing something like Nintendo DS. Now the V is $120 when it's not on sale. It's actually on sale right now for $108. But I actually think that the VS is a better choice if you're getting your first handheld, because that one's going to be under $100. It's $98, although on sale right now it's $88. And while it doesn't boot into Android, it can make use of custom Linux-based operating systems, which are going to be really simple and easy to navigate. One in particular that I recommend checking out is called ArcOS. I've made a whole video about this one here. I'll leave it linked down below. Either way, if you are looking for a retro handheld emulation system that is vertically oriented, I think that the VS is your best choice, coming in at under $100. Now, one other variable that I tested to throw into the mix is the Retroid Pocket Flip. Now, obviously, this is not a vertically oriented handheld, but you know, when you open up the clamshell, it kind of feels like that. And one advantage of a clamshell like this is the fact that when you open it up, it's a lot roomier because it's wider. And so because of that, it does feel really good and comfortable in the hands, especially compared to a vertically oriented handheld, which is a little bit more cramped feeling. Now, this one's quite a bit more expensive. It's like $180, but this thing can play just about everything all the way up to GameCube and PS2, although not all of those games, but most of them will play well. And so under $200, I think that the Retroid Pocket Flip is a great choice as well. Now, when it comes down to it, I'm not trying to sell any of these devices to you right now. I really just wanted to talk about what you can expect for your money at these different price points. And to give you an idea of what to expect, the Game Boy DMG that I bought on eBay was $80 altogether. You can definitely get them cheaper, but they'll be more beat up and things like that. But all the same, I would expect to pay between $50 and $100 for a decent DMG. And in the end, I'm very happy with the purchase that I made. Yes, it was $80, but honestly, what is that? Like the price of 10 fancy cheeseburgers? I'm willing to make that sacrifice to have the experience of playing the Game Boy for the first time in 30 years. And not only that, I do actually plan on playing this from time to time. I had a lot of fun just yesterday playing it a bunch, and just the nostalgia of playing these games on original hardware just can't be beat. On top of that, it makes a really great conversation starter to have this on my bookshelf and then maybe hand it to a friend and be like, hey, do you remember how these used to be? Look at how they are today. Either way, yes, I really enjoyed the Game Boy DMG experience, but I'm not really sure it's something I can recommend for anybody. When it comes down to it, in terms of functionality, yes, I would say the Game Boy DMG is pretty poor overall. A lot of that comes from the screen, which of course can be upgraded, but all the same, that original feeling is not going to be as great as you may expect. Really, when it comes down to it, if you want to spend about the same amount of money, I would recommend getting a Miyoo Mini Plus or an RG35XX. And for a little bit under $100, you can get the RG353VS, which I think is probably the best vertical handheld for your money right now. Now, if you're looking for a really solid emulator for under $200, I do think that the clamshell of the Retroid Pocket Flip is a really good choice too. And of course, if you consider yourself a purist and you want a very authentic experience, then you cannot go wrong with the Analog Pocket, as long as you're willing to wait as long as it takes to actually have one arrive at your door. Anyway, that's really about it for this video here. I just wanted to talk about my experience of playing the Game Boy, and I'm really glad that I took that day off to really kind of dive into it and experience it firsthand. So let me know what you think in the comments below. When was the last time you played a Game Boy, or have you ever played one, and what is the experience like if you were to try it today? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.